Aerospace has proliferated their assets both throughout LEO and now the public stock exchange. As of January 29th, Aerospace is now a publicly traded company with a splashy IPO valuing them at $4.75 billion. Additionally, Samara Aerospace co-founder and CEO Patrick Haddix joins us to talk about their $10 million seed raise, as well as the technology and promise of their Hummingbird satellite platform.
SpaceX has transformed their existing satellite constellation into an infrastructural layer for space situational awareness, announcing Stargaze. Using their star trackers to capture and track orbital objects and debris, SpaceX has now successfully built the cause of and solution to the crowded LEO environment.
Washington Harbor continues to harbor no restraint as they invest heavily in the ground station market. They led a $100 million Series B round for Northwood this week after buying a ground station maintenance company last week. This should help Northwood deliver on their recent $49 million Space Force deal. Welcome to this week's episode of the Space Times podcast. As always, I'm Paul Mayer,
here with Harrison Lambert,
excited to share this week's space industry updates with you. We hope you enjoyed the episode, as hosting you so far has been an absolute blast.
We've expanded our offerings recently from the podcast to include full-length interviews on our YouTube and weekly newsletters emailed directly to your inbox, hopefully to drive more value to our audience. We hope you will check these out if they're of interest to you. We love all the feedback and engagement from our audience, so please keep tuning in every week on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, and drop a comment on our LinkedIn or Blue Sky with anything you enjoyed or would like to see. This week, we had the privilege and the pleasure of talking to Samara Aerospace CEO, Patrick Haddix, about their $10 million seed raise round that we talked about last week. We're going to start off by cutting to a portion of that full-length interview, and we'll come back to our normally scheduled programming.
Pat, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Stoked to be here.
What are you doing at Samara Space? What are you building at Samara Aerospace? And where are you currently and where are you going?
Yeah. No, it's helpful to establish a little context because we're doing things a little differently than other space companies. So, yes, I'm the co-founder and CEO here at Samara, co-founded with my very good friend Vedant, who I met in grad school at the University of Illinois. I got to watch him develop some groundbreaking new satellite control technology while I was over there, and we saw the commercial potential of that sort of breakthrough. So we decided to build a company around it. So at its core, Samara Aerospace is a satellite bus manufacturer. There are quite a few out there nowadays, but we're doing things differently. Our bus is built around a fundamentally new way to rotate satellites in space. Traditionally, satellites are rotated, to make sure they're pointing in the correct direction using a series of spinning flywheels known as reaction wheels, oftentimes control moment gyros as well. These have a number of sort of setbacks involved with them, including vibrating your satellite, which is really bad for sensitive optics. They have a very high failure rate as a mechanical moving part, and they are big, heavy, and expensive. So what we do instead is embed actuation right into the hinges of our deployable solar panels. This system is called MSAC, which stands for Multifunctional Structures for Attitude Control. This is the core invention that was developed and patented by my co-founder. This allows us to vibrate our solar panels in little circular patterns, giving us the same rotational effect as a series of wheels without applying the extra mass, with the added benefit that our system is also performing active noise cancellation, exactly like a pair of noise-canceling headphones. Any disturbance on our satellite, it is actively canceled out with an equal and opposite vibration of the solar panels. So we're creating a slimmer, lighter, more agile satellite platform with orders of magnitude more pointing stability, enabling sort of the next generation of satellite optics, and overall just kind of making it cheaper and easier to get to space.
Congratulations on your $10 million seed raise. That is a huge accomplishment. So I'd love to hear sort of what the terms are, where the company currently stands, and what the goals and milestones are for the deployment of this initial capital.
Yeah, thanks. No, we're stoked that we hit that milestone. Yeah, a little backstory there. We closed the pre-seed round last year used the funding to deploy our first hardware to space. So what actually kicked off our seed round was how quickly and effectively we built and delivered and integrated that on orbit demonstration of our MSAC hardware. Impulse Space, who is the host of our satellite, actually referred Valerian Space Ventures over to us. We were happy to kick things off early with them. Yeah, and they sort of preempted the seed round. We targeted an $8 million raise. We put in the term sheet that, the ability to stretch that up to 10, and good thing we did, because we ended up having to turn some investors away at the end. So yeah, we're really stoked. The capital allows us to grow our team. We have a massively oversized facility here. When we started the raise, we had 1,000 square feet per employee, which is too much. So now we get to hire like crazy. We're going to put our first Hummingbird satellite in orbit in 2027. We have a launch booked for that summer. And yeah, the big milestone of the raise is just to get that thing built, delivered, and operated in 2027. Of course, next step for me is Series A raise. We're likely to kick that off this year.
So tell us a little bit about how you're sort of viewing your current, or I'll say like beachhead market, and then your additional sort of markets therefrom.
Yeah. So if you asked me a year ago, I would have said our beachhead market. And it still is optics. Earth observation seems to be making a little bit of a comeback, which is nice. And optical comms are just becoming more and more the standard in orbit. So our beachhead are customers that want to fly either or both of those payloads for sure. But we recognize that the satellite bus market is getting competitive. Has been competitive for a couple of years, and there's more and more people switching, like traditional companies starting to sell their own hardware. So what's always been the goal is to eventually operate our own satellites. We're just sort of bringing that goal into the present a little more quickly.
I've had this feeling that we're underselling like how different this is compared to anything. Like, is there anything this thing can't do?
Yeah, and I want to be clear that there's some downsides, but yeah, it does sound it sounds far-fetched and too good to be true. All new technology does. But what convinced me is like I got to spend, I think, 2 years just sitting with Vedant trying to poke holes in it and convincing him why this isn't commercially viable and it's an academic problem. And every step of the way, he's like, "Oh no, I solved that." And here's why this is easy, and here's how you make it survive launch, and all these other problems. But we are using, no secret, piezoelectric crystals that expand and contract very, very slightly, but with a tremendous amount of force. And we've developed custom flexures that wrap around that and sort of amplify that motion. So you get a trade-off. It's a lever arm, basically. Yeah. You get more displacement with less force out of those actuators. So some of the downsides, it's not off the shelf. Reaction wheels are off the shelf. Any satellite can go to Blue Canyon and you can bolt 4 of their wheels anywhere on your satellite in the correct orientation. It's plug and play, no big deal. Ours, you have to know the solar panel. You have to design a system specifically for that solar panel and that satellite, and hinges that are this far apart, etc. So that's one downside, and that's why we're building the whole satellite bus and not just selling a component.
And the other 6 degrees of freedom control.
Each panel has 4 degrees of freedom and has 4 actuators.
Oh, okay.
We are purely rotation, so we can rotate the satellite. We can't do the 3 translational degrees of motion, if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah.
Well, all right. So I misspoke. You can do like millimeter bumps back and forth if you're doing like advanced proximity ops and docking or something, and you need to jerk the panel out to one side. You can bump the rest of the satellite off to the left. So that's something you technically can do. The other downside, I would say, just because it's important to let people know this isn't a purely miraculous God system. Peak slew rate is probably going to be lower than if you put some giant reaction wheels on your satellite. But where we make it up in agility is our ability to use a tremendous amount of torque to reach our peak slew rate almost instantaneously, and then we stop on a dime. Other people, it's a slow ramp up to a higher rate, a slow ramp down, and then you sit there waiting for your satellite to stop fluttering and wobbling, and then you can take your picture or whatever. Us, it's just boop, 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 done. You're good. Active stabilization the whole way.
And
So
is there anything preventing the customer from adding control systems? Like if they wanted to put a reaction wheel in the payload area?
Not at all. Yeah. The initial system was designed to fly in tandem. Initial back in like grad school during its development was going to fly in tandem with reaction wheels purely to cancel out the instability caused by said wheels. And then Vedant had this sort of aha moment where he's like, oh, if I'm clever about how I vibrate the panels, I can also rotate the satellite while canceling the jitter.
And does this work with any solar array? You said there was some limitation there.
No, I mean, we're thinking about different form factors and everything, but it really helps us to have very rigid traditional solar arrays. And in some cases, the heavier, the better. So like if you have cheap solar cells ready to go, supply chain's not an issue, but they're heavier. That actually gives us a benefit. We get more control the heavier the panels are. We've even toyed with the idea of putting our batteries in the solar panels. You would never get that in traditional design, but it's like, okay, wait, hold on, that would give us a control advantage. Now that is a thermal nightmare that we'd have to solve. So again, future R&D project, but these are the things we're excited about. We're like, wow, there's so many new cool things you can do with the satellite when you change this fundamental way it's developed.
Just want to say thanks again for joining us. It was an awesome conversation. I think your technology is so cool. I can't wait to see it fly on your first Hummingbird.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This week, we've got tons of very interesting news. A lot of it spread across the communications section of the space sector. We're also covering topics on space mobility, as well as Earth observation, and then our usual business food and tech advances. But to start us off, as we mentioned in the opening, Northwood has raised a staggering $100 million Series B round of funding that is led by Washington Harbor Partners LP and co-led by Andreessen Horowitz. This follows them landing a $49 million Space Force deal, which is also a significant amount of money. So lots of money coming in for Northwood. Northwood's been a pretty high-profile company as of recent. They're led by a pretty famous Disney star, Brittany Mendler, but that's probably the least of her accomplishments. It's a very interesting company using phased array ground stations to communicate with the ever-increasing population of space assets. So very unique technology. What I find interesting is that Washington Harbor Partners shows up again this week after we mentioned them just last week, and they've been popping up here and there over the past few months. They seem to be on a tear, trying to gobble up all these Earth ground infrastructure kind of technologies. I think they're seeing a real signal from the growth of space assets and this kind of choke point that has been space to ground downlink. Last week they bought up Radome Services, which is a ground station servicing company. And this week they announced their investment in Northwood, which is a ground station provider of pretty cutting edge technology.
Yeah, they pretty clearly identify the ground station segment of the space value chain as a bottleneck. And to be clear, it absolutely is. So their attempt to more or less monopolize that bottleneck and dominate the market share of capacity and capability at that layer in the communication chain is one from which they'll be able to effectively extract a lot of rent. So it's a straightforward and pretty clear thesis that they're delivering on, and I'm not at all surprised that Andreessen Horowitz wanted to join them in that endeavor.
Yeah, they've been popping up as well a lot. I think the space industry is starting to get some real attention from deep tech VC as it kind of starts to pivot towards a more established sort of industry. Eutelsat being one of those established players, they operate typically Geocom satellites. They're a French telecom provider, but also are the parent company to OneWeb, announced that their planned sale of a passive ground infrastructure to a private equity firm that they announced back in August of 2024 will not proceed. So this eliminates roughly $658 million of expected proceeds. Definitely interesting to see in a week where so much was spent on ground technology, ground communications technology. And it is critical to their OneWeb technology. So I was kind of surprised to see them selling it at all. Last week, they bought 340 more OneWebs from Airbus, still using their old version that has RF communications to ground, although they plan to upgrade to optical communications to ground. So they will need to upgrade those ground systems. So they really did. It was really an odd play for them to try to sell off their ground infrastructure to private equity. But my guess would be that they're trying to raise money to continue their OneWeb deployment, and they would need to make new ground stations anyway. So the old ones are probably not worth what they were selling it for, and maybe that's why this kind of fell apart. But interesting to see that one like Washington Harbor is spending hundreds of millions of dollars on ground stations, and Eutelsat's not able to sell theirs.
Well, to that point, there's some reporting out of Reuters that actually cites a reason as to why this deal got canceled or sort of fell through. But they're pointing to the French Minister of Defense, who's directly saying we're not allowing this sale to go through for national security concerns. So France is allegedly, they view Eutelsat and they view that ground station layer as a key component to their sovereign capability, and don't want that to enter the private markets in the hands of a private equity firm who most likely has a non-French origin.
That's interesting to point out. I feel like we'll probably see some funding come into Eutelsat soon from the French government then, in order to kind of lessen the impact of losing out on that profit stream.
Yeah, that I would not at all be surprised to see Eutelsat win a few contracts in order to help assuage the loss of 2/3 of $1 billion.
Yeah, and it already seems like some of the ESA and French government agencies are helping them along. Like we talked about the Space Rise Consortium last week, which is going to most likely benefit OneWeb in development of their next version communication constellation. In that vein of communication constellations, ApoLink has partnered with ground segment provider RBC Signals. So this is a newer space company doing ground provider services. CRBC Signals, they've been doing this for a little while, along with companies like KSAT and LeafSpace. The goal is to resell the startup's proposed in-orbit relay services with the aim to fill connectivity gaps when satellites are out of view of terrestrial command and control links. So this is a problem that exists with low Earth orbit for ground stations, and why they need so many ground stations to keep coverage. But typically a satellite in hundreds of kilometers of low Earth orbit only gets to see a ground station for about 10 minutes. So in those kind of blackout zones where they don't have a ground station in view, the ApoLink is trying to develop technology to allow these satellites to relay data between each other in low Earth orbit. We talked about them about a month ago when they bought their relay satellite buses from GomSpace. So this looks like they're filling out their architecture by purchasing the ground segment of this architecture from RBC Signals. With more ground station tech news, Airbus announced an agreement with Skynapy to leverage the startup software-defined ground station tech. This aims to decrease the latency on Airbus's Pleiades NEO Earth observation constellation. Pleiades NEO being a pair of 30-centimeter Earth observation satellites. So this is very high resolution, as we talked about recently. This is up there, the state-of-the-art, like Worldview Legion, Worldview 3, Planet Pelican. So these are high volume data images, and trying to improve the downlink to Earth for these is important, not just in order to get more images, but to get them at a lower latency, which are key metrics for end customers. Skynapy is a French ground station company. So again, going back to your point that France is really focused on this space sovereignty over this space to ground communication chain. Looks like they're standing up Skynapy to be one of their key players. And the fact that they're partnering with Airbus, who's the provider of the buses for Eutelsat, is really closing out this trifecta of news for this week in that sort of sector.
Candidly, I'm really impressed with how disciplined France has been about standing up and maintaining a sovereign vertical stack. They've they've been much more active about doing so than Italy or Germany or even arguably the ESA or Europe as a whole. And I'm sure there's a multitude of different reasons as to why we're seeing a little bit more activity. I would not be surprised if some of the larger incumbents out of Italy and Germany already have a little bit more of that capability stack already sort of housed up. So, lack of engagement and direct effort from Germany or Italy might not necessarily reflect that the two are lagging in any capacity, but still just very impressed with how diligent and disciplined France has been in consistently supporting their own sovereignty and consistently adding to that capability stack.
Yeah, I think it kind of harkens back to when we were talking about the consortiums forming amongst the ESA late last year, kind of in response to the US's pullback from supporting space technology for the EU. When a lot of countries were complaining about the amount of money they're putting in and where it's being distributed to, I feel like after that point in time, we saw a lot more motion from Germany and France to build up their own sovereign capabilities, and to some extent the UK, while still supporting the ESA. And it's really interesting to kind of see how that symbiosis plays out, because Germany has traditionally not been a strong aerospace player, but they've stood up capabilities extremely quickly. That Rheinmetall contract we talked about, like 1.7 billion last year, is huge in that scale for that particular sector for Germany, and I think signals their seriousness about this. And to your point, France really does seem to be kind of gathering their forces to make some very quick plays in this area. They're a much more traditionally aerospace country. Like Thales and Airbus have both been working great for them for decades. So I think they have a head start, and that head start is giving them the kind of room to better strategize in their play. On the US side of things, SpaceX is revising their BEAD filing. So this is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment. It is a federal program to provide grants to businesses, primarily fiber communication businesses, for deploying broadband communications capabilities to rural areas. The satellite businesses have been able to bite off a piece of this, I believe $30-40 billion financial vehicle. And SpaceX got around $733 million of grants from that program, with Blue Origin, I believe, coming in second, around $300 million. So there's kind of a beef going on between the two with this filing. SpaceX wants to relax the requirements on Starlink in terms of how much service they actually need to provide. So they're arguing that if they provide the hardware free of cost and a discounted service, that they can't be held responsible for who actually signs up for it, and they should still get their grant even if customers don't sign up for it. There are requirements in the program that require that they kind of hold on to some of the spectrum bandwidth for those customers should they arrive. But SpaceX is arguing that they can dynamically allocate it like they always have without jeopardizing the kind of equity aspect of this program. So the NTIA, which is the agency that handles this grant, seems to be pushing back a bit. They've asked the states not to sign the petition. So it looks like it's being discussed internally there. And I wouldn't be surprised if Blue Origin has some things to say about this, seeing as how they're the other benefactor. Whether they outright block SpaceX from doing this to make it harder for them, I kind of doubt, because it would probably also make it harder for Blue Origin. But it'll be interesting to see if the allocations kind of get redeployed following this petition. Globalstar is planning on launching a new constellation, which would double its current fleet to 54 satellites. This includes 6 in-orbit spares that operate at the same 1,414-kilometer orbit by the end of 2026. The company has remained relatively vague on what their C3 constellation will offer, but if history is any indication, it is likely another D2D service provision using high-power S-band communications. This is what has been supporting the satellite phone technology for Apple. And it looks like Apple has contributed $1.1 billion in funding to expand this constellation. that will be built out by MDA and Rocket Lab, who we previously reported on working on these sort of constellations. So it looks like they might be back in business to build out these 54 satellites. It's interesting given that Globalstar had announced late last year that they were exploring a sale of their business following EchoStar Spectrum deal, $17 billion for that Ka band internet backhaul spectrum.
About half of which in equity, if memory serves.
Yeah. But the fact that the C3 constellation is using S-band, which is a lot less valuable than that Ka band, makes me think that the sale likely won't go through, that Apple's continuing to invest, and maybe Apple makes a play here to build out their own capabilities so they can stay independent of Starlink, which is kind of coming to eat their lunch.
Makes sense. I would imagine that Apple sees the same existential business threats that we do to their capabilities and their stake in this market. I know that we'd spoken about a couple of different contracts, primarily in the D2D market, involving both Rocket Lab and MDA. So it seems like Apple has been sort of nurturing and building those contracts or those relationships for a little while, maybe in direct sort of response to some of those contracts or previous contracts being canceled, or potentially leaving a void, an opportunity for those companies that might need a little bit more business. So we'll see. I'm similarly unclear as to whether or not the S-band capability is meaningful enough to actually make an impact.
I think it is, like, given that Apple's satellite phone capability is more of an SOS service, so the bandwidth's a lot lower than internet backhaul, the S-band makes sense, but that does limit them to what they can expand into. It kind of fits into the trend we're seeing of constellation companies aren't outright trying to compete with Starlink because they know they'll lose, but carving out their own niche alongside Starlink seems to be the play here. And I think that's kind of what Globalstar is doubling down on here. Emergency services, maybe some maritime services, although we usually see that in UHF and VHF band, not S-band. But I could definitely see them carving out their niche in emergency services and some sort of rural SOS kind of service. So MDA Space is also partnering with another company to build out a communications constellation. Hanwha, the South Korean defense conglomerate, is contracting MDA Space as well as Telesat to build out a defense constellation for South Korea. This is using MDA Space's Aurora platform to make the Lightspeed compatible LEO broadband network. So Lightspeed is Telesat's LEO constellation technology that they're also bidding towards IRIS² over in the EU. So this seems like a great solution for some of these countries that are pursuing communications sovereignty apart from the US, to partner with Canada, who is a much more friendly country these days, to quickly stand up their capabilities while they work on developing their own. So in the case of the EU, they formed their own consortium and started building out IRIS² amongst their key players like Thales, Airbus, Leonardo. But in the meantime, Telesat's kind of pursuing that contract. And it looks like in South Korea, where Hanwha is perfectly positioned to kind of build out this capability, given that their success with the Nuri rocket and other space defense applications, I would not be surprised to see them eventually build their own sovereign capability. But for now, it looks like they're looking to Canada to kind of stand up that constellation as quickly as possible. And some of the more traditional, maybe less traditional, but more what we've seen in the past kind of communication, Astranis is partnering with the MB Group, that's MB, Mike Bravo Group, to deliver Oman's first dedicated communication satellite, which I think is a misclaim on the part of that article, given that last year Oman purchased OmanSat from Airbus, which is a much larger and more traditional geocom satellite. So it was purchased from Astranis is for a smaller geo satellite, which is why I say it's less traditional. These are becoming more popular as time goes on, given they're less of an investment in technology. They're a bit more fractionated. You're able to kind of build it up as you go along. They don't have quite as long lead times. They're not as complicated. So this is part of a $200 million investment in sovereign connectivity as part of Oman's Vision 2040 program. Terran Orbital is delivering a nebula bus for Mitsubishi Electric LEO demo mission The Mitsubishi Electric LEO demo mission will feature the innovative Nebula platform equipped with a quantum key distribution and optical terminal payload, provided by a Japanese team comprising members of the National Institute of Information and Communications Technology, Mitsubishi Electric, and other Japanese partners. This is an increasingly common application that we're seeing in the space industry, and it's very exciting to see quantum deployed. It is a quantum leap, as I keep humorously calling it. Very funny.
Hilariously calling. Don't sell yourself
I
short.
appreciate all the laughter. It is a big change in how we do encrypted signals, and that's becoming increasingly more important as communications are moving to space. It's always been a challenge to kind of keep that information away from prying eyes or ears, as it may be. Quantum key encryption allows that communication to become much more secure, extremely hard to decrypt, if not impossible by theory. But we'll see how that plays out in practice, since none of these applications have fully deployed yet. There have been small demo missions deploying quantum technology. A few governments have done it. But we haven't quite seen the deployment of these major applications. Maybe the biggest that we've seen recently coming from IonQ, making a multi-billion-dollar play to stand up a distributed quantum-enabled space technology. But definitely interesting to see this move. Mitsubishi Electric is a big player in Japan, and Japan has always done very impressive space missions. And Terran Orbital is a pretty big group out of Lockheed Martin. So big brass from America backing up Japan to try to stand up this capability. It'll be interesting to see how it progresses.
Yeah, I mean, we're gonna talk about IonQ in more detail a little bit later, but fascinating to see this level of collaboration and investment happening globally simultaneously. There have also been a handful of different big announcements coming out of the space mobility sector here. Leading the charge is Blue Origin, who announced that they were halting space tourism business for at least 2 years so that they can focus on lunar missions. They've reached 38 launches of the New Shepard, their space tourist vehicle. And in total, they've reached a total of 98 humans into space, just shy of the 3-digit mark. And candidly, I mean, this makes a lot of sense out of their business operations to focus on lunar missions. Space tourism was always such a fantastical and far off market. It's really good to see Blue Origin really grounded and down to earth in their business applications and what they're going for here.
Yeah, space tourism was like a weird market. It never really made sense. I was surprised they were making enough money at it to justify continuing to launch. But now that they're focused on the moon, at least Katy Perry has a new dream to aspire to.
An unfortunate setback for the Rocket Lab Corporation. So Rocket Lab has been working on their Neutron rocket development for their heavy lift vehicle. And as they've continued to develop and push the vehicle to its limits, they experienced a stage 1 tank failure overnight during some hydrostatic pressure trials. The setback doesn't seem to perturb the Rocket Lab team, which we would absolutely expect. We would absolutely expect the team to come out and say, hey, this is under control. We'll be able to solve this, no problem. But the setback nonetheless delays their launch ability. They were focused on a launch in Q1 of 2026. This is undoubtedly going to push back the Neutron's inaugural launch for at least another quarter. Still on track for a 2026 launch, but a setback nonetheless. They're rooting through all of the various testing data to uncover the root cause for this rupture and failure, but it does closely mimic and mirror a similar launch failure for their Electron rocket, or test failure from their Electron rocket earlier in, well, I guess back in
don't ruin their perfect record, man.
It wasn't a launch failure. Absolutely right. But that testing setback for the Electron closely mimics this testing setback for the Neutron. So it could be indicative that they're implementing some new technology or implementing a new process in the manufacture, refurbish, or assembly stage of things. But
yeah, it's very similar to like SpaceX having a bunch of tank failures where they were upgrading their tank designs to use the carbon overwrap pressure vessel, and when they're doing the cryogenic methalox containers. So it's interesting to see kind of parallels here, especially at this stage of their development. I wouldn't think they would be upgrading their systems, but maybe they found something at this stage of testing, because they're still going through testing of the Neutron that prompted them to do an upgrade.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, point being that this is likely a systemic thing rather than two separate identical point failures. So likely a systemic thing that they're going to be able to identify with their review and solve moving forward. So a whole bunch of confidence that Rocket Lab is going to be able to launch Neutron in 2026 and that they're going to be able to hit the majority of their milestones here moving forward, despite this setback. Additionally, a fun announcement is the Atlas Cup, the first ever satellite racing league.
Yeah, this is a first of its kind, really. Spacecraft racing has never really been a thing, maybe in movies. There was the Rocket Racing League back in 2007, founded by Peter Diamandis, who's kind of a serial aerospace entrepreneur. They were able to get off one race, but after that, it kind of fizzled out, mostly because of the financial crisis in 2008, which I think these kind of moves are very dependent upon a good economy where people are willing to spend a lot of money on entertainment and sports, which, by most arguments, we're in a pretty good economy now. So if ever there was a time to race spacecraft, I suppose it would be now. There's certainly some cool spacecraft I'd like to see go head to head. But ultimately, I'm just really interested to see how this kind of play moves out, particularly because it is a new economic vertical in space. And I always love to see those.
Yeah, I mean, space racing and sports and entertainment are largely correlated with the broader market. So a lot of overlap and similarities here. If the market's doing well, this, that, or the other is going to see interest and growth. And it's sort of a corollary to luxury goods, more or less.
Yeah.
But a fun announcement nonetheless. Additionally, Exotrail and Astroscale, both companies with strong presence in France, have specialized in a multi-orbit satellite project together. So Exotrail focuses on LEO service vehicles and is partnering with Astroscale France, a subsidiary of the Japanese-based on-orbit servicing company, announced a partnership on January 28th aimed at testing deorbiting capabilities in LEO. The mission hasn't yet been fully approved, but there's been a handful of different American startups that have been promising and demonstrating this capability to varying degrees, pointing to Starfish Space, pointing to Cal Morris Industries. And this particular partnership is still in the selection process by the French government. But this comes after Astroscale contract wins in both the UK and Japan over the last month. And both of these companies had pretty strong presences at the Space Mobility Conference out of Orlando last week, proudly demonstrating their orbital logistics capabilities, which the keynote speakers, Generals Whiting and Purdy, were large advocates for and very excited to see materialize and those capabilities realized in the market. UARX Space, a European leader in satellite deployment and in-space transportation systems, has announced the signing of a contract with Atmos Space Cargo, a European space logistics company developing reusable return systems. Again, pulling back and pointing back to that interview we had with Andrew from Space Phoenix, there is a rapidly growing and explosively sized need for space logistics and solutions on orbit and for all different layers of that stack. So it's great to see more partnerships and more players working at solving these problems, as at the end of the day, logistics is fundamentally it's fundamentally a throughput industry, but the first sort of stepping stones of that throughput are dependent on inventory. And so the more players we get in there, the more inventory we're going to be able to see, the more throughput we're going to be able to see driven through the space logistics chain.
And it's kind of crazy, like the prescience of Andrew Parlick talking about how like this is kind of the year for this. Like we're already seeing that pop up. Varda has their contribution with Southern Launch to handle their Winnebago spacecraft. So that's in space manufacturing there. And we've got Space Launch working with Avio to do launches for Brazilian satellites. So a lot of this logistics seems to have a resurgence, especially when I saw Space Launch, because they had a rocky go of it when SpaceX kind of took over a lot of the launch integration responsibilities. But it seems like there's definitely a comeback particularly this week. I'm expecting to see it continue to grow because a lot of these, like Winnebago has 4 more missions this year, so Southern Launch is going to get some more business out of that. It's cool to see the EU stand up kind of their own in-space logistics play here. And I'm keeping an eye on this kind of market because I think Andrew might be right. It's kind of been a boom cycle right now.
Epic Aerospace successfully made contract with their Chimera 1 at 53 million kilometers distance. This is the furthest communication for any commercial satellite, and they're still working to return the orbital transport vehicle. So Chimera 1 was launched into a lunar flyby trajectory in February of 2025 and lost communication at some point. By the time they were able to establish communication again and recover the satellite in its part, it was already millions of kilometers away. So super fascinating to see them, one, get back in contact, and two, still have plans and an executable idea here for how they can return the OTV back to Earth orbit.
Yeah, this one's crazy. Like this thing flew on a pretty cursed launch of the Falcon 9. There were four satellites being sent to the moon, and 3 of the 4 of them had pretty much doomed missions. One of them was the Intuitive Machines lander that tipped over. Another one was a NASA moon napper that missed its mark and flew off into space instead of in orbit around the moon. And Chimera 1 had the same fate where it couldn't make communications in time to do the transfer burn to get into moon orbit and instead started drifting off into space. They're having issues contacting it. They had to jump around to a bunch of different antennas all around the world to get a flight software update up to the spacecraft to be able to control the thrusters. But they believe that if they can get in communication with it, they still got all this fuel on a really high thrust thruster on board their spacecraft, similar to Impulse Space's thruster. That should be able to get them back to the Earth and potentially recover their orbital transfer vehicle. So really cool article from Ashley Vance interviewing the founder of Epic Aerospace. They are looking for time on the deep space network in order to communicate with their satellite, because at this distance, that's pretty much the only network that can get them what they need. So if any of our listeners have connections to deep space network, reach out to Epic Aerospace. Let's help bring Chimera 1 home.
UK defense space startup Shield Space has secured a £2 million funding, marking another step forward in sovereign satellite protection capabilities and on-orbit resilience. The round was led by Mercia Ventures via the Midlands Engine Investment Fund 2, with participation from Twin Path Ventures, ROI Ventures, and P3A, supporting the company's growth as it prepares for its first orbital demonstration. They're building proximity satellites for interception and defense like Fortastra and Lodestar. And as we've spoken about, this is very much one of the growing areas of concern and priority for both national defense and security concerns.
Yeah, it makes me a little worried that we're gonna have boxing matches out in space soon. But it definitely seems like a growing demand to see 3 different companies kind of come out of stealth in the past month or two, when prior to that, I didn't know of any. Definitely makes it seem like there's a strong signal and demand for this kind of capability.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to see what their propulsion solution is on orbit for being able to provide those sort of capabilities. We've spoken about this extensively before, whether or not it's better to have liquid and solve the cryogenic problems, whether or not it's better to have a series of different solid propulsion systems that are one-time use, but having multiple of them would provide some resiliency and some continued ability there, or whether finding and having some sort of hybrid solution would be the best path forward. But really, really interesting to see this market so rapidly and suddenly mature seemingly out of nowhere.
In the imagery side of things, we have a lot of news in both the Earth observation and non-Earth imaging segments of space industry. The biggest news, in my opinion, is coming out of SpaceX this week, where they announced Project Stargaze. This is going public in the next few weeks and is a crazy implementation of their already in orbit capabilities. So So when they say it's going public in the next few weeks, I mean it's going live, because these sensors are already on orbit. They're just turning on the spigot, and it's going to be a free service to all satellite operators. What this is they're turning 8,000 of their 9,000 Starlink spacecraft into non-Earth imaging assets. So this is much like we talked about with ArcSec back in December, where SpaceX must have figured out a way to turn their star trackers into satellite tracking imagers, which, as Torvin described, would require that they kept the capability of a star tracker while also allowing it to gather data, orbital data on other satellites in space. This will most likely be for low Earth orbit. I think the range on these are probably not going to cover GEO, but given that LEO is getting very crowded, pretty much entirely by SpaceX, so about 90% of the satellites up there, this is a welcome addition to the existing space situational awareness capabilities, which are primarily through the Space Force with the conjunction messages that they send out to satellite operators. This will be an additional capability that will hopefully help avoid collisions, which are becoming more common. I don't know if I'd say more common, but they are happening continuously. And we talked about a few last month.
Collisions are happening continuously, or like close calls and avoidance maneuvers necessary to preempt collisions?
Now, there was the Starlink deconstruction last month, but they claimed it was their own satellites, not necessarily collision. We did see the collision with the Shenzhou and the Spain sat, but they're not really LEO, so I wouldn't really group them in with the same kind of problem.
Sure.
But we did see the what was it called? The Luke Olymp collision this week, also out in GEO, but that was projected to be a collision between spacecraft. So it's something that happens, not quite too frequently. It seems like statistics is still on our side, that the likelihood of two objects hitting in space is so low. But I think this is in anticipation of that kind of shifting soon. Starlink is approved to launch another 7,500 Starlinks for their current tranche of Starlink satellites. So that would almost double the number of satellites in orbit. And then they're getting approval for 15,000 more satellites in VLEO for their version 4 Starlinks, which would again double. So they're looking at more than quadrupling the size of Starlink in the next couple of years. And that's not to include all the other countries and companies that are launching their constellations. And so I think this is really a play for better collaboration between their constellation and other constellations, because we don't want a cage match between Kuiper and Starlink happening out in space, because it would be bad for everyone.
Right.
And hopefully this will help them deconflict that. So not great news for the space situational awareness industry. Companies that are trying to sell services to improve space situational awareness might have some headwinds against Stargaze, particularly because it's so proliferated and because it's free. A player in that space, HEO, which is an Australian non-Earth imaging startup, announced the purchase of Satellogic's new Sat 34 this past week. This is on the back of Satellogic making several large sales over the past few weeks, hundreds of millions in contracts going out for constellations to Portugal's engineering society, as well as some other constellations. And HEO has been getting some great momentum as well. They've recently launched a payload on the Impulse Mira to demonstrate a new capability for their non-Earth imaging. They've flown other payloads as well and captured some really impressive images with that camera. But it's going to be interesting to see how kind of this pure play non-Earth imaging startup is going to compete against something the size of Stargaze. I think what we'll most likely see more of is all these companies pivoting towards the space defense kind of applications that we talked about with Shield Space and for Task Red Lodestar and other proximity operation applications. What that means for their technology, if it's a clean pivot, it's not clear. Maybe for some of them it is, but we still have companies like Scout Space and Orbit Fab developing, and Blue Ring out of Blue Origin, developing capabilities that are more specialized towards rendezvous proximity operations and monitoring the sat space assets for the purpose of defense against adversarial encounters. S2A Systems, which is a Swiss non-Earth imaging company, detected a fragmentation of the Luch Olymp spacecraft in geograveyard orbit this week. This is not only impressive because they're able to detect an event out in such a far orbit, it's, I think 50,000 kilometers out. And the video is really cool. If you look it up, it's you can see the thing just blow into smithereens, which is very unheard of in geograveyard orbit. Like this is so far out that the statistical likelihood of things hitting is just made extremely minuscule. Granted, most satellites do operate on the equator, so it is minimized to kind of a plane. But the whole purpose of graveyard orbit is to kind of just get the satellite out of the way so that it doesn't get in the way of geosynchronous orbit. But collision events like this can cause problems with debris because they can scatter back into geosynchronous orbit and interact with some of these really big, expensive satellites, like we saw with the SpainSat NG2 failure last month, which was, I believe, a $600 million write-off. So not good to see. It's going to come in. It's going to question the assumption that geo graveyard orbit is the best way to decommission some of these satellites. And I wouldn't be surprised if it starts kind of showing some trends towards some of these end-of-life disposal satellite services like Astroscale to develop geo-focused satellites to kind of remove some of those spacecraft out of that domain as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating thing to see a full-on collision and disintegration like that, not only at geo, but at geo graveyard for all the reasons that you expressed. And it very much highlights the need for geo graveyard orbits, which have largely been sort of a I'll say temporary or makeshift solution that has become the norm. So successfully deorbiting and successfully removing things past their life cycle, one would fully expect the needs of that to grow exponentially. I would expect to see companies that are able to and boast the ability to deorbit assets themselves, even if those assets are fully destroyed in doing so, to have a lot more growth and momentum on the back of this pretty darn bad update here.
Yeah, or even maybe reservicing as a business might get a boost from this sort of problem. Like we saw with the Xi'an demonstrations out of China last year. They were really focused on refueling and life extension services for geo satellites. Leonardo DRS announced that it was awarded a subcontract to provide infrared mission payloads in support of the Space Development Agency's Tracking Layer Tranche 3. This is interesting to see, as the Tranche 3 has recently been distributed to Rocket Lab, L3, and Lockheed. Leonardo DRS, being a large prime out of the EU, is out of Italy. It's interesting to see them become part of a pretty large American defense constellation. But infrared payloads are key for missile tracking. They're usually wide field infrared monitoring to pick up heat signatures of rocket launches and then hand that off to other command and control satellites to track it, much like we've talked about with like the long range radar detection that Lockheed has. So I see this as playing in well. Potentially, my bet is that they're integrating into Lockheed's satellite for Tranche 3 because it would play well with a lot of the other tracking capabilities that Lockheed has for missile detection. And Kratos expands hypersonic infrastructure as VisionWave is unveiled as a space-based counter UAS architecture. So this is them developing a new technology for countering drone technology. They are targeting a $1.5 billion bucket of contracts for the Mach TB 2.0, which is a defense contract for hypersonics, so counter hypersonics. I find this an interesting pivot for them because they are kind of a hypersonic company building hypersonic vehicles, but they're positioning themselves as more of a counter drone technology, like a rotor drone technology, rather than a counter hypersonic technology, which seems to be a much easier application. I've expressed some doubts as companies like Apex Space and Lockheed talk about doing orbital interceptors, having rockets on orbit to intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles is a really, really hard problem to solve. But what Kratos is proposing here is that they can create some sort of kind of soft weapon, like a RF jamming kind of kill chain for UAVs based off of satellite and infrastructure of RF and imaging observation for this sort of weapon.
Yeah, it's a much easier physics problem to solve the frequency and wavelength side of things rather than it is to solve Newtonian laws of motion. So I would agree with you that space-based orbital interceptors, fundamentally on a very F equals ma level, a very difficult and challenging physical problem to solve. But the niche of being able to do this with soft weaponry without needing to necessarily use momentum or a physical object or hard weaponry to prevent or disable or disarm UAVs opens a lot of potential doors. In addition to the communications and imaging updates that we've had, there have also been a plethora of major business moves, the biggest of which by far is York Space Systems IPO. They went public on January 29th at a $4.75 billion valuation, and their stock price has largely held steady. So the 29th is, I believe, Thursday. And so from Thursday through the weekend, their stock price has largely held steady. We'll probably see some move in the early part of next week as the market sort of adapts and reacts. But largely holding steady after an initial open is a pretty impressive feat. So good job to the team there in pricing things appropriately. So this public offering nets the company just over $625 million in cash, 629 to be more exact. And the stated purpose for this money, the stated goals for York Space with this capital raise is to increase their production capacity. They're currently quoting about 300 satellites annually in production capacity. They're wanting to roughly triple that, get closer to about 1,000 satellites per year. And as an aside, they've also mentioned that they're open to M&A opportunities, merger and acquisition opportunities to secure their supply chain should such opportunities present themselves. You should read this as we desperately want this public fundraised money. We desperately want this capital to secure our supply chain through M&A, but don't want to be too obvious or overt about it and drive up the price or undermine our negotiating position. So I fully read this as them putting a red herring as the primary reason, and the actual main reason for this money is to secure their supply chain, something that we actually spoke about in previous weeks to great effect. So York's revenues have been dominated by government contracts. Just in 2025, the first 9 months of 2025 that have been publicly reported and available, over 90% of their total revenues, I believe it's 270 million, are from government contracts, government customers. And the remainder is on the commercial side, about 11 to 15 million, if memory serves. So we'll go ahead and round that and just call it 90%, though those numbers indicate it's a lot closer to 95%.
We'll round it to 0% commercial.
Great. So we'll round it to 0% commercial, which means that government spending is a huge potential risk for York Space. So, you've heard the expression, the tail wagging the dog. This isn't necessarily that, but York Space is effectively captive to their government customers. So if the spending priorities for Space Force, Air Force, USG, DoD, DoW, if those priorities shift, York has to shift and adapt with them, because their commercial side of the business simply isn't there and isn't resilient enough. So not necessarily a deal breaker or a major concern in any capacity, but it is something to be cognizant of, that York is so exposed and their customer base is so concentrated on the government side of things. So any changes there, York will feel much more acutely.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting pure play. Like if you wanted to bet on the U.S. defense spending to keep going up, then York would be a good investment, because they are pretty much entirely dominated by their proliferated warfighter contracts. Their only other program is a PEX program for NASA, which is not going to bring in much money comparably. So really, the only growth they can do is in their profit margins or to other government contracts, but PWSA is one of the biggest ones. The MDA Shield, as it's ramping up, might bring in some more money for them. I'm also curious if you think they'd be a target for acquisition. I think a company like Northrop that's been conspicuously left out of a lot of these PWSA tranches could certainly scoop them up if they start doing well enough to get on a competitive footing with the other large primes like Lockheed, Raytheon, L3, Rocket Lab.
Yeah, I could see. I mean, now that they're publicly traded, I could very much see a major contractor or a major prime who is to date largely been left out of the PWFA and the sort of the new space defense ecosystem. I could very much see that happening. I mean, York has, I think, an 85%, 83% to 85% efficiency or closure rate on the proliferated warfighter network contracts that they've bid. So they to your point, are, 110% of their revenue comes from those contracts. They are so emblematic of a one trick pony or one note bands, so to speak, that's everything that they do, and they are so closely tied to that. I could very much see them continuing to sort of grow those contracts and expand that into other major defensive efforts that you alluded to. I could also see somebody like Lockheed Martin or Northrop Grumman or Raytheon. I could also see another major defense contractor wanting to participate and wanting to get in on those contracts and that stream of contracts, trying to buy them out now that they're just publicly traded. A shell company chaired by venture capitalist Raphael Roskin began trading on the NASDAQ stock exchange January 28th after raising $200 million to pursue a merger with a space-related business. Space Asset Acquisition Corporation, a special purpose acquisition company that offers a fast track to the public market for firms seeking capital, priced its initial offering at the standard $10 per unit. So the big news here is that SPACs are back. 2020
back on the menu, baby.
Yeah, that's right. 2020 to 2021 was sort of was the big SPAC boom. And we had one SPAC in July of 2025. And yeah, that was iRocket's merger with the BPGC Acquisition Corp in July of 2025. And this is the first of 2026, but that's still two more than we had in the years between 2021 and 2024 inclusive. So SPACs look like they may be coming back, which would represent a pretty big vote of confidence from the investor community. LPs and current equity holders would get the opportunity to sort of liquidate and cash out of the industry. This would also potentially provide some really meaningful DPIs and some really meaningful returns to folks in the investing community who would then presumably turn around and want to reinvest that money rather than walk away and take their ball and go home effectively. So for those of us who have forgotten about SPACs and sort of what they do, given that they haven't been in the zeitgeist or the news for the past 5 years, a quick crash course. So a SPAC, or Special Purpose Acquisition Company, is a shell company. It doesn't do any operations. It just holds cash. So that shell company goes public and becomes publicly traded. Then, with all the money that it raised from that going public, with all of that money that it has because it just holds cash, it turns around and it buys or merges with a target company, an acquisition company. That company is then, ipso facto, publicly traded. Remember when SpaceX bought a whole bunch of spectrum from EchoStar for $17 billion? Well, half of that was in equity. So back then, one of the things that we spoke about was that buying EchoStar stock gave you a position in SpaceX because EchoStar held $8 billion in equity of SpaceX. It's a similar thought here. You've got this shell company that winds up buying the acquisition company. So by buying shares in the shell company, you are buying effectively shares in their acquired company, in their portfolio company. And so this type of vehicle is one that provides a much faster and quicker route to liquidity for folks that have been in the industry for a little while. And if this is the start of the SPAC spigots turning back on and that those taps starting to flow a little bit more freely, we could see some really meaningful liquidity events here in the space industry that would return a lot of capital back to investors who would then hopefully in turn reinvest that back into the space economy to see those returns doubled.
Yeah, do you have any predictions about who they might be buying?
Well, they only raised 200 million. So space is pretty capital intensive. There's not too many companies that are large enough to where 200 million bucks would buy them outright, but they could buy some meaningful equity positions in some larger scale companies who are maybe still a little ways off from an IPO. But there's a couple that come to mind.
Yeah, I think my short list is like Impulse Space, Vast, and Axiom. Like they've been speculated to possibly go public this year. Impulse only makes sense because Momentous back in 2021. Another orbital transfer vehicle having a go at it kind of makes sense, but I don't know. Like given Tom Muller's reputation and the success they're having, I feel like it doesn't make sense to go that route. Axiom, maybe, but they got Intuitive Machines already public and they're Cam Gafarian, so I don't see why they would need another one to go public. That kind of makes sense to me, given that it's a long shot for space habitats, and this is probably a good way for them to raise money. And they have a vast one gone up already, and they're continuing to build. So I think it makes the most sense there.
Yeah, I could see Vast. I think that SPACs, in my mind, are traditionally for companies that aren't necessarily in sort of the growth stage or aren't necessarily in sort of that rapid growth approach scale. This isn't a way to get new capital into the company. This is a way to get old capital out of the company. Like this is how people cash out. This is how people exit their positions rather than providing an opportunity for new investors to come in. So like folks who view SPACs as vehicles for new investment to come in are probably folks who are having difficulty raising a new round of institutional capital, which is that's a pretty negative signal. That's pretty tough to get around. So I would envision this more as companies that are, Firefly IPO'd last year. I'm trying to think of other companies that are sort of in a similar wheelhouse or similar ballpark to Firefly in terms of like maturity and where they stand, but that would fit the price point of $200 million, buying a meaningful like 50 to 60% share of the company that they would be able to be effectively publicly traded.
Maybe like Ursa Major, given they got through their Series E, they're a rocket company.
I could see that. Some of the older incumbents that have been around for a little while and have been executing and doing well, but have been maybe moving a little bit slower in the capital markets. I could see that happening. Ursa is a good candidate for that. Is Black Sky or Black Star are those publicly traded?
I don't think Black Sky is, but that is a good choice.
Yeah, that's where like I would put my money on candidates in that ballpark.
Yeah, some of the like Digital Globe Max are going public.
In addition to some of these major announcements, IonQ has agreed to acquire Skywalker technology for $1.8 billion in cash and stock. This acquisition is meant to accelerate IonQ's roadmap, cutting design to first sample time for its 256 qubit chip from 9 months to 2 months, and targeting the first 200,000 qubit chip from fab in 2028, which the company says could enable roughly 8,000 logical qubits and pull forward a 2 million qubit timeline by up to a year. Major capabilities acquisition out of IonQ. And to paint a little bit more of a picture, since 2025, IonQ has acquired or agreed to acquire Skywater Technology, a semiconductor manufacturer, Skyloom, a quantum compute and communications company, Seed Innovations, an ML and AI research expertise stack and company, Oxford Ionics, quantum compute hardware stacks, Vector Atomics, quantum position navigation and timing solutions, Capella Space, Star Satellite Manufacturing, and LightSync Quantum Optical Interconnects. They have acquired and spent up to neighborhood of $10 billion if this price point is any indication. They've spent, we'll round up, round down, whatever, but we'll ballpark it at $10 billion.
I think I saw like 8.6 billion. So yeah, around that.
They've spent a king's ransom on building out a fully integrated quantum computing network. Now, to be clear, they haven't actually built any of this capability internally. They've gone out and acquired all of it, but figuratively speaking, the build versus buy question, they've very much come down on the buy side of the fence. But boy, have they been buying. Niccolo De Masi, their board chair and CEO over there, is anything but bored as he's been spearheading this just tear on acquisition. He joined the company. Well, he'd been on the board for years, but took over the role of CEO in February of 2025, and then in the now calendar year since then has deployed billions of dollars in capital acquiring and building out this capability and capacity. So fascinating strategy and play here. Traditionally, typically, big acquisitions that vertically integrate like this generally don't play out super well. And there's a couple of different reasons why, but effectively what happens is when you're a big company and you're making these big acquisitions, a lot of the acquisitions that you're making are in fairly commoditized or well-mature industries. So you're spending a lot of money for a lot of capacity and some capability, but the market is mature enough to where prices and margins are pretty level and pretty flat. What that means is that when you're integrating this company, when you're going through with the actual execution on the operational side of what that acquisition looks like, you don't have a whole lot of room for error. So to quote, chess.com here, you got to play this game with 90 to 95% accuracy in order to wind up turning a profit. If you make a couple of mistakes and you wind up coming in at an 85% accuracy rating here, you're going to wind up losing a little bit of money on the deal because those margins were so tight to begin with. Now, quantum computing and the entirety of the quantum industry here is much more nascent. So doing a direct comparison between aviation or space hardware and what we're talking about here, it's not a fair apples to apples comparison. It's there's enough innovation and there's enough meaningful differentiation in all of the technology stacks that we're talking about here that the upside is not limited to what we typically see. Typically in those big traditional acquisitions, the upside is limited to what amount to more or less cost savings. So you're smashing two companies together, you're cutting out 20% of the labor force between those two companies because you already have HR and operations and all of these different roles filled. So you're able to save some money on the costs there. Very rarely does doing so drastically grow revenues. It's mostly on the cost saving side of things, mostly a scale deal rather than sort of a scope deal. And so what we're seeing here is that because this is so nascent, because this is so new, a lot of the thesis that they're executing towards here is about growing new revenues, growing the market, growing revenues, rather than sort of saving costs amongst all of these different efforts, amongst all of these different companies. So depending on how big that upside is, depending on what they sort of how tall the trees grow, so to speak, the quote unquote that sort of accuracy rating, like they could wind up with a break-even accuracy at like 50%. Because the trees grow so big, because they're expecting to grow revenue so darn much, they could wind up making a whole bunch of mistakes and how they're executing things and how they're implementing everything and still wind up on top. Now, all of that basically boils down to how valuable you think that the new revenues are going to be, how valuable you think the quantum computing, quantum network actually winds up being in the future state. And so that's sort of where you're able to quantify what actually is and isn't a good deal. But this is an impossibly hard challenge that they can absolutely execute on if their team is sort of aligned and if everybody knows, hey, this is what we're trying to do, this is what we need to do here, and this is how we're going to get it done. But to put numbers on it, if they need to hit like a 50% accuracy on their operational execution here, they can be super successful. If they need to hit like 90% or 85% operational accuracy, that's going to be a really tough sell.
Yeah, I think you're right in that this is a really big swing, and they either hit a home run or they just miss. And given this guy's track record, I am pretty bullish on this company to succeed. It all signs indicate quantum is going to get here. It's just a matter of when. And having somebody like this pushing it along really rings to me like SpaceX back in its origination days. Like this guy got his money from being an operator, being a CEO, getting his master's in quantum from Cambridge. So this guy knows what he's doing. And all the moves he's making seems to indicate that he has a very clear plan to be able to get all these people on board to do this. And I'm really bullish on this because this is probably the only play I know of that could really upend SpaceX's advantage. If they get quantum networking correct, they will leapfrog traditional communication constellations. Everybody else will be a generation behind, and they'll have built a solid moat to keep that advantage and start harvesting profit from it. If they get quantum computing correct, they leapfrog the orbital data centers being planned. If they get quantum encryption right, like defense budgets will start flowing their way because it's going to be the best thing around. So if they get this right, they're getting it really right. And I could see them getting huge on the scale of SpaceX, but bigger, because there's really not something above quantum that we're aware of that could leapfrog them. So they're really playing for like this next generation development that could really just blow everything out of the water and could become huge if they're successful. And so I'm just really excited to see them start deploying some of this technology and where they go in the next year, because they're if they think they can reach 2 million qubits in the next year, that's kind of insane. I would also expect to see them buy a rocket company at some point if they need to start putting satellites up. Like that could be one of the key restrictions to their plan if they're beholden to companies that have vested interests in traditional communications constellations like Blue Origin and SpaceX.
Yeah, why the hell not? We got to juice those numbers. We're only at 8.5 billion. Let's get that up to 15.
I mean, what's a Scottish rocket company cost these days? Surprised they didn't buy Orbex last week. I guess it's still up for sale. They never really closed it with the exploration company.
Well, we'll take our finder's fee on the back end, IonQ. Nicolo, if you can call me anytime. Additionally, and a little bit closer to home, NordSpace received a $335,000 grant for additive manufacturing development. So this follows the Canada Rocket Company's $6 million seed raise from a couple of weeks ago from the Launch the North competition, which shows that Canada's desire and attempt for sovereign launch and space capability remains consistent. They are continuing to spend and invest in developing sovereign launch capacity and sovereign launch cadence.
Yeah, love to see it when our northern neighbors start building missiles or rockets. I mean rockets. In tech advances for the week, this is news that doesn't fit into the main topics or business advances or business news. We have a really big one that I wanted to cover, which is that SpaceX has filed with the FCC for up to 1 million orbital data centers for AI. That's right, 1 million data centers in space. We complained about the quadrupling.
We thought 200,000 out of China was ambitious.
Yeah, 200,000 out of China, 200,000 out of Rwanda. Like they're right now, there's filings for 750,000 total satellites. SpaceX just comes in like, let's just double that. I have major doubts that those other hundreds of thousands of satellites will actually come to fruition. China, I'm a little more like they'll probably do it. Rwanda, I don't see that happening. But 1 million for SpaceX it's I wouldn't put it out of the realm of possibility. They've certainly got the capabilities for it. It makes sense given their telecommunications backbone through Starlink, given their capabilities to launch with Starship. Like, there's really nothing holding them back at this point, except maybe the FCC. Like, I can only imagine how they reacted when they received this filing.
Who knew that that the first Dyson Sphere would be made entirely out of compute AI centers?
Yeah, yeah. This is Kardashev level 2 type stuff. Like, we become the next generation civilization. And to really hammer that home, the SpaceX has formed two shell companies out of Nevada, both called K2 Space, so Kardashev 2 Space. They're very clearly moving for that purpose. And the rumors coming out of Reuters are that SpaceX is going to buy XAI and merge those companies prior to going public. Which, if you remember, XAI bought out Twitter earlier when Twitter was in so much debt that they wanted to offload its XAI and use the kind of shell company there to cover for it. It looks like they might be pulling the shell game again with SpaceX just before going public and kind of using the money raised through that effort to cover for SpaceX. And furthermore, they're expecting to merge with Tesla once they go public. This all seems like financial engineering to me, and quite shady. Not that they're any strangers to that. But on some level, it does make sense. Like, XAI is AI company that might need SpaceX's satellites to do data centers in space, and those data centers are going to need gigawatts of power. I think they said like 100 gigawatts, 200 gigawatts over the next decade or so. So Tesla makes sense to be integrated with that as well. So not. I don't want to say not crazy, because I feel like everything SpaceX does is kind of crazy, but not impossible. These satellites are planned to be put into 500 to 2,000 kilometer orbit, which I don't love. That's a pretty packed orbit in LEO, and when they deorbit, they're going to be passing through these busy orbits. But what we've talked about with Stargaze, and given Starlink's pretty good track record of not hitting other satellites, it's just another problem for them to solve. Varda W5, that's Winnebago 5, as in the mobile meth lab that they cook out of in Breaking Bad, has returned to Earth. This is the first of the year. They still have Winnebago 6 through W9 planned to be launched and returned for the rest of the year. So Varda is a in-space manufacturing company. They've had, I believe, 4 successful launches already to manufacture biopharmaceuticals in space. W5 was a joint U.S. Navy Air Force Research Lab program called Prometheus, and they're just testing out autonomy and hypersonic flight of this vehicle. And Varda is testing out their new C-Pica heat shield, which is a phenolic impregnated carbon ablative shield. Not the most common type of heat shield, but NASA has spent some time working on it. It is one of the most advanced forms, though, and it is great for returning spacecraft, which this Varda spacecraft was meant to go up to orbit, manufacture products, and then return them to the ground to be delivered to their end customer. This is being coordinated by the Southern Launch Company, which is a launch and satellite operations logistics company, and they are landing out of the Kaniba test range in Western Australia. So getting some more business down there in Australia, like we covered last week with Gilmore Space Systems. NASA has selected Axiom Space for its 5th private astronaut mission to the International Space Station. This is scheduled for 2027. They'll be sending 4 astronauts for 14 days to the ISS. This, as it's indicated, is their 5th mission. The previous missions have done science missions with private astronauts. And these are trained through NASA, but they're from a variety of countries to get them involved in space travel, human space travel, and just generate more awareness of that need, which is Axiom's primary business. They've worked on science projects such as cancer therapeutics and artificial eyes and other in space manufacturing research projects, which kind of reinforces the idea that Axiom Space will likely play in that arena as well very soon. We saw them launch a couple of orbital data centers a few weeks ago. So even though Axiom is primarily for in-space habitats, the kind of vehicles that they're building out make a lot of sense for other applications like orbital data centers and on-orbit manufacturing. So the fact that they still have momentum, they're getting funding from NASA to do these missions, indicates that they are making progress, going to be ready in 2030 with their private space station to take over for the ISS. And it's interesting to see them on this mission collaborating with Voyager, who's working on their own private habitat called Starlab. So we've always kind of reported them on them as competitors, but it's great to see them collaborating. I always love to see friends where there could be enemies.
That is a wrap for the week's recap of the space industry. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and as always, please drop us a comment, check out our socials, and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, our Substack newsletter, or wherever you're receiving this signal. Big shout out and a big thanks to Patrick Haddocks over at Samara Aerospace. And until next time, this is Paul Mayer and Harrison Lambert signing off for now.